As she said, I'm Annalise Povolo. I'm the Director of Administration and Programs for the Lake Leelanau Lake Association. And I will be presenting today on our Shoreline Stewards Program, in which we try to restore our shorelines and, in doing so, remove terrestrial invasive species. So let's get into it. A little bit about what I'll be talking about today. So I'll be talking about what I mean by terrestrial invasive species and how they impact our shorelines, then go into our approach in handling them through an integrated pest management approach, how we integrate this program with our Shoreline Stewards program, in which we do shoreline consultations, a little bit about how we train our shoreline ambassadors, how we market and educate about these programs, and then some of the metrics of the programs. So, terrestrial invasive species. What do I mean when I say terrestrial invasive species? So different from aquatic invasive species that you might be familiar with, such as Eurasian water milfoil, curly leaf pondweed, rusty crayfish. Terrestrial invasive species in this context are referring to the species really on the shoreline. So not necessarily the more upland species such as hemlock woody algid, but species that are in the intermediate zone between full-on upland terrestrial invasive species and aquatic invasive species. So the terrestrial invasive species of interest that impact the Lake Leelanau watershed are yellow flag iris, invasive phragmites, and purple loosestrife, as you can see there on that slide. So a little bit about those species. Yellow flag iris is a beautiful but quite dangerous plant, which is honestly part of the problem, as it is a horticultural favorite because it's a lovely flower. It's native to Europe and Asia and arrived in North America in the late 1800s and then got to Michigan by the 1930s. So it's been here for a while. And it spreads through seeds that can actually transport through the water and grow as it's been floating from one area of the lake to another. And then it can also reproduce with some vigorous rhizome growth. So it's a highly invasive plant. Then invasive phragmites, it has been the most common invasive reed since the middle of the 20th century. And it's very similar in appearance to the native version, the native Phragmites americanus, but it is highly invasive and can easily outcompete the native and other native shoreline plants or wetland plants. And then purple loosestrife, another beautiful but dangerous plant, also native to Europe and Asia. It's highly invasive. Each of these seed heads here can produce over 2 million seeds, about the size of ground pepper. So it is also highly capable of spreading, yet again, making it a dangerous invasive species. So a bit on the impacts of these terrestrial invasive species. So I've kind of color-coded them there, as some of these impacts apply to one and some apply to all. So similar with other invasive species, they have the ability to outcompete native plants. They're invasive in nature. That's what makes them invasive species. And that allows them to form monocultures, so outcompeting the natives and being exclusively that one species of plant, which obviously alters the native ecosystem. They all, in doing that, reduce the food resources, the native natural food resources for wildlife and insects. And in the case of purple loosestrife specifically, can be unwelcoming to waterfowl. So if you don't have those native waterfowl inhabiting the area, that also affects the ecosystem. Because a lot of these plants have such dense root or rhizome growth, they can actually increase sedimentation and reduce water flow in an aquatic environment, ultimately making an aquatic environment move more into a dry environment. So of course, drastically changing the ecosystem there as well. And then in the case of yellow flag iris, their roots are actually poisonous to animals. So of course, there's a detriment there. And so the Lake Leelanau Lake Association, in recognizing that we had these species in our watershed, looked into ways in which to tackle it, and we have developed an integrated pest management approach. So when I say pest, that refers to any kind of nuisance species. It doesn't have to be a critter, like rodents, but a pest also refers to these invasive plants. So this approach is really a system that uses all suitable techniques in a total management system to prevent these species from reaching unacceptable levels or getting them to acceptable levels, reducing them to the point in which we can handle them. And the purpose of the approach is to manage them with the least possible impact on both people, property, and also the environment. And so that's defined by EGLE, the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy. And I've got those two logos up there for EGLE and the Northwest Michigan Invasive Species Network because they are the resources that we've relied on heavily to develop this approach as kind of the experts in both the regulatory systems and on best management practices. And so I'll be going all through these in more detail, but here's a brief overview of the components of our IPM strategy. So the first is to identify the location of various species. So this is important. You need to know what you have, where you have it, and how much you have. And it's important to do so when the species is in bloom. We're talking about plants, so we need to be able to recognize them, and the easiest way to do that is when they're in bloom. Then the next step is to identify control techniques for each species. So this consists of reviewing the literature and consulting with experts. And then communicating to the property owners whose properties have terrestrial invasive species. In the case of a lake association, most of the properties along the lake are private properties. So this involves educating those private property owners on the best management practices, how to control it themselves, or how we as a lake association can help them. And then if necessary, when others are doing the control for them, you have to make sure that you gain permission from the property owners to control the TIS, terrestrial invasive species. And then once you've obtained all of that information, applying or assisting and educating on how others can apply the control techniques. So a big part of this is really understanding the stipulations of different control techniques in different environments. For example, the EGLE aquatic nuisance control regulations do not allow any application of herbicide in areas where there's standing water, so a real aquatic environment, unless they're applied by a certified pesticide applicator. It's also very important to know when a permit is required and when it's not. And then the last step is really managing the organizational risk associated with the program. And I'll go more into that in more detail in a moment. So the first step, identifying the location. We've done this through shoreline surveys. So we have actually contracted an environmental consultant to perform these surveys. And we started at the shoreline, even though we have a lot of terrestrial invasive species in our greater watershed, but you had to start somewhere. Hopefully, we'll be able to expand the program beyond the shoreline and into the greater watershed. A lot of these species like to hang out in culverts by the roadside, and hopefully we'll be able to expand to those areas in the future, but we've just started at the shoreline. So in the middle there, you can see the results from our purple loosestrife survey, which was completed in the summer of 2023. And that identified 249 infestations on both North Lake Leelanau, South Lake Leelanau, and the Narrows and the Leland River. And that these infestations, even though you can only see the individual dot on the map, actually range in the extent of the infestation. So from one individual plant to purple loosestrife covering the entire shoreline. And you can see that it's a bit denser in areas. So in this area that we call the Narrows, in between North Lake Leelanau and South Lake Leelanau, we've got a very dense, heavy infestation there. And then early this past summer of 2024, we had that same consultant perform yellow flag iris and phragmites surveys together at the same time, in which we found 164 infestations of yellow flag iris. But a lot of those infestations were not nearly as dense as purple loosestrife, where many of the infestations were just a single plant and hardly any the entire shoreline covered like purple loosestrife. And then we found 2 infestations of phragmites just at the southern end of the lake. So that was our process of identifying the terrestrial invasive species along our shoreline. And then our next step was to identify the control techniques. Now we know what we have, we know how much we have, how are we going to control it? So using the resources from the state of Michigan and other experts, we've identified the best management practice for each species based on the extent of the infestation and the location. So particularly as in if it's in standing water or it's not, because there are different regulatory specifications for that. And then in the case of purple loosestrife, the proximity to other areas with large infestations, which I will get into more in a moment. And so the best management practices that have been identified are mechanical control, so hand digging, mechanical removal. Primarily, this is used for smaller infestations for purple loosestrife and yellow flag iris, as they can be incredibly difficult to dig up once they've grown larger. Mechanical removal can be used to some extent with phragmites if it's detected very early on, but it quickly gets to the point where mechanical removal is not feasible because of the plant's considerable rhizome growth. And then for larger infestations of purple loosestrife, biological control is possible. That's why I made that in purple here, because this is really only an option for purple loosestrife, which is through the use of the Galarucella beetles, which are beetles that have been highly studied and determined to be safe to introduce into the environment to specifically control purple loosestrife. And I'll go into more detail on that in a bit. And then also for those plants that are too large to dig, sometimes chemical control is necessary. Again, using the state's guidelines for application. So only applying herbicide in dry areas and hiring a certified pesticide applicator to apply it in areas with standing water. And so those are the control techniques that have been identified. And again, with the different considerations to how big the infestation is it small enough to be just mechanically removed, which is probably a more environmentally friendly option than a chemical application. And is it in standing water? There's all these different stipulations to consider when thinking about which technique to apply. And so after figuring out what we have and how to control it, we have to communicate what should be done. And so communication and education are very important factors of our strategy. We do this from the Lake Association through broad communication, which fits through our association's overall goal of educating our community on risks to our watershed and ways in which everyone can do their part to help. So our association publishes monthly to bi-monthly e-bulletins on topics of relevance to protecting the watershed. And during the times in which these terrestrial invasive species of interest are blooming or about to bloom, we publish articles about them so that we can increase awareness in our community. We explain why they're an issue, what folks can do about it, especially based on the extent of their infestation. And then we also publish ads in our local newspaper to extend our reach with this information, as you can see in this wanted poster for purple loosestrife. And then all of this information, in addition to what we're doing about it, is also published on our website. But we understand that not all of the properties on Lake Leelanau infested with terrestrial invasive species are going to take action based on this broad communication. So we've also incorporated direct communication with property owners whose properties have been identified to have terrestrial invasive species on their shorelines. So the shoreline survey that we perform marks with the precise GPS coordinate the location of the plant identified. So then we consult our county property or parcel database to get the property owner and address information. And so then we've put together a terrestrial invasive species database that lists the property owner's contact info, the type of terrestrial invasive species on the property, and the extent of the infestation, and therefore the recommended treatment option. So using this information, we have initiated an annual letter and email campaign to contact these riparians to educate them about the terrestrial invasive species on their property and inform them of the different options for control based on the severity of their infestation. We also include an ask for them to contact us and keep us in the loop about how their control went so that we can provide them with any other information and answer any questions. And then if a certified pesticide applicator is needed for control on their site, we have them get in touch with us so that we can provide them with a list of certified applicators. And as mentioned before, getting permission from property owners is an important step if someone else is going to be providing control. So there are different requirements of permission depending on the control technique. For example, in 2023, we facilitated obtaining written permission from property owners who wanted the environmental consultant to dig or to assist with hand digging on their properties. So we assisted with some written consent for that. And then in 2024, we also facilitated the release of the Gallerusella beetles, the purple loosestrife beetles, on select properties, which I will talk about more in a moment. But to minimize our risk in doing that, we purchased the beetles, but then riparians had to provide permission by signing a beetle request form. So this form certified that the person signing it was indeed the property owner. It acknowledged that the Lake Leelanau Lake Association is not making any representations or warranties regarding the use of the beetles. It included an agreement to follow the precise handling instructions or guidelines that we provided to ensure successful placement and survival of the beetles, and then also acknowledged the receipt and review of the informed consent package that we provided to them. So that's an important step if that is performed by someone else. And then after all of that information is obtained, then we're ready to actually begin applying or guiding riparians on the techniques for how to control the terrestrial invasive species. So giving you an example, and as I promised, I would give you more information about the Gallerusella beetle that we have used to control purple loosestrife. So this is an option if you are in areas with really dense infestations of purple loosestrife. So as stated before, we recommend mechanical or hand digging for smaller infestations, but if it's a larger infestation, and especially an infestation that's in standing water, this could be a better option than other options like chemical control. So for purple loosestrife, the use of biological control with Gallerusella beetles has been approved by the state of Michigan and has actually been in use for decades and has even already been in use in the Lake Leelanau watershed already. These beetles are obligate feeders, so that means they exclusively feed and complete their whole life cycle on the purple loosestrife plant. So they eat the plant and the flowers, making the leaves look like Swiss cheese, like you can see in the photos here in this one, which is actually from where we have released the beetles. And so that stunts the growth of the plant and reduces its ability to spread. It's important to know that this is not a full eradication method, but really a control method. The beetles are used in those areas where there is purple loosestrife covering the entire shoreline, where mechanical control would be incredibly difficult or near impossible. And again, a good option for infestations in standing water. But they must be used for large infestations, so like 100 plants or more in a quarter-acre area, because as obligate feeders, they won't survive if there is no more purple loosestrife there for them to live and eat on. So basically, once they've chowed down on an entire plant and there's no more purple loosestrife around, they won't survive. So then using our data from the shoreline survey, we went through and identified areas on the map where there were really dense infestations. There are other boxes here that you can't quite see because the dots are crowding them out, but those are areas where there were dense infestations. So where beetles would have a suitable amount of purple loosestrife to sustain their population. So we separated out these properties during our targeted communication with the property owners, encouraging those property owners to contact us and fill out a beetle request form so we could provide them with the beetles to release on their properties. So we purchased the beetles in bulk at a bulk rate from the Tip of the Mitt Watershed Council, and they come attached to a purple loosestrife plant. So it has the beetles, the eggs, and larvae all secured with this fine mesh netting. And that's all around a compostable pot. So we basically loaded up our cars with the pots and delivered them to the properties where they'd requested the beetles to control those dense infestations. So then you take those compostable pots and bring them as much towards the center of the purple loosestrife infestation as you can, where you then remove the net, shake out any beetles clinging to the mesh so that they fall on the purple loosestrife that's already there. And then that plant that you bring in with the beetles and eggs and larvae gets incorporated into the existing infestation, and the beetles can then disperse into the rest of the infestation to feed on and reduce the spreading capabilities of the plants in that area. So that was our strategy, in addition to putting into educating our riparians who don't need to do the beetles for the purple loosestrife. And so a bit about what we've done or will be doing for yellow flag iris and phragmites, because we just completed our survey for those two species this past year. So we are beginning our programming in this coming year, and our strategy for yellow flag iris is quite similar to that of purple loosestrife, other than the use of the beetles, which is not possible for yellow flag iris. So we will guide the riparians on the treatment methods that are most suited for the extent of their infestation, and then really encourage the ownership of the issue themselves, making sure they know how to identify the plant on their property, what they can do to control it, and giving them the ownership to be a part of the solution. And then for phragmites, as I mentioned before, herbicide is really the most recommended treatment method for this plant. So the two infestations that we have on Lake Leelanau warrant some professional assistance using herbicides. So we have engaged the Northwest Michigan Invasive Species Network, which is our local SISMA, or Cooperative Invasive Species Management Area. And they have a grant that allows them to offer a very reasonably priced cost-sharing program to treat infestations over multiple years to ensure the infestation is handled. So this will begin in the fall of 2025 and continue at least until 2026, as I said, multiple years to ensure that it's taken care of. So then the treatment will be performed in the fall, because that's during Phragmites' translocation phase, where it's actively moving the nutrients from the leaves down into the roots. So by applying the herbicide to the plant at that time to the leaves, it actually maximizes the herbicide's effectiveness in reaching the plant's critical tissues. And so it ensures a more thorough kill throughout the entire root system. So that will be performed in 2025 and 2026. And so the last step in here is really considering the risk associated with the control techniques and minimizing them. So a big part of how we have minimized our risk as an association is by putting an emphasis on the riparians themselves. We need you to help control terrestrial invasive species. So first, we educate on the issue. We provide treatment options. We put this out on our website, in our broad communications, and then the direct communications with property owners, where we're actually asking them. We're providing specific instructions to follow best management practices and encouraging the property owners to control it themselves. We provide all the information they need to do it themselves, so including disposal instructions if they're doing any mechanical removal, how to dispose of them, where they can dispose of it, clear instructions for safely using herbicide if they're doing it themselves in areas without standing water. And then if the infestation is too large to dig or is in standing water, we provide resources for certified pesticide applicators in the region. And then if we're going to have any hand in the treatment, we minimize the risk to ourselves by obtaining written permission from the property owner and providing full and informed disclosure about the treatment. So those are the the 6 steps of our process. And again, much of the success of our management will be dependent on the ability of our lake community to implement control techniques on their own. So therefore, our goal is really to engage, inform, and encourage the community on how to safely and effectively control terrestrial invasive species when feasible. And when they can't do it, then we figure out how we can step in and provide aid, still in ways to minimize risk to our association. So it's our goal through that process. We've got a 3-year goal for these species in which we can reduce purple loosestrife by 25%. We hope to reduce yellow flag iris by 20% in the next 3 years. Again, because we don't have the beetle as an option. So that's really a lot based on the ownership of our community to do the work themselves. But then we have the phragmites goal as 90% because we're able to work with the invasive species network to handle that treatment, and they will be doing that consecutively through the next couple of years. And so we hope for at least a 90% reduction in 3 years. So that's a lot of detail about our terrestrial invasive species program. So now I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk to you about the Lake Leelanau Lake Association's Shoreline Stewards Program, which does really integrate with the terrestrial invasive species program as well. So this program was started in 2022 by our now president, Nancy Popa. She is a master gardener, and as she became more involved with the Lake Leelanau Lake Association, began training more on natural shoreline restoration, taking advantage of the Michigan Natural Shoreline Partnership and their wealth of information on natural shorelines and their Shoreline Stewards Program. And her interest was really the impetus to the creation of our Shoreline Stewards Subcommittee, which started that year with Nancy and one other board member and one interested community member of the association. And so that spring, we started offering our first shoreline consultations, in which we go to someone's property and consult on how to improve their shoreline and their property in general to promote natural shorelines, to protect the lake from pollutants, to protect their property from erosion, and also to promote all of the other benefits of natural shorelines. At that time, Nancy led almost all of them, while myself and other interested volunteers slowly joined the group and started shadowing her. And then that fall, Nancy and another member attended the Michigan Natural Shoreline Partnership's Certified Shoreline Professional Training so that they could develop a deeper understanding of the work that goes into shoreline restorations, especially those higher level bioengineering projects like you can see here. So then using the training and the resources, Nancy was able to build a training program for more of our committee members to become shoreline ambassadors. So just a little bit about that training program. Our training program is rather robust. We've estimated that it takes between 15 and 20 hours or possibly more to complete altogether. It brings together a lot of resources from the Michigan Natural Shoreline Partnership, Eagle's Shoreline Stewards Program, and other local resources such as familiarity with our local conservation districts, native plant sales. They do shoreline plant sales in the spring. So knowing the timing of those, and then also familiarity with terrestrial invasive species and how to control them. So this training involves in-person training in which the trainee shadows a qualified ambassador for at least 3 consultations to get a sense for how we handle the consultations and how we communicate with the riparians. And because there are just so many resources out there, we've also compiled a list of extended education for things that build onto the required training materials. Most of our ambassadors have completed these materials because in addition to being really interesting, they're actually pretty fun, particularly the Michigan Shoreline Stewards Rate Your Shoreland survey, which is something that asks you specific questions to your own lakefront property and really makes you think more critically about your shoreline stewardship in a myriad of ways, from how you treat your upland zone and all the way down to the shorelines and your use of your shoreline. So a bit of what we do on a shoreline consultation. Our main strategy really is to listen to the riparian about what they want for their property. Obviously, we want to recommend best management practices, but they really have to align with the intended use of the property. And we have to understand that first for it to resonate with the property owner. So after listening, we can then start to throw in some recommendations based on the type of shoreline present and what the riparian is looking to do. The most common topics that we address are ways in which to reduce shoreline erosion. We give a lot of native plant recommendations. We talk about the reduction of impervious surfaces and other ways to reduce stormwater runoff. And we give advice on the permitting process and information on what needs to be permitted and what doesn't. But before we go on a consultation, now that we have a comprehensive terrestrial invasive species database, we search that database so that if there is TIS on that person's property, we can be prepared to offer recommendations and resources for whichever terrestrial invasive species is on their property, especially if we haven't already been in touch or that we haven't had a dialogue with the riparian about it. So that's the main way that this integrates into our terrestrial invasive species program. We give out a lot of handouts at the consultations as well, such as the Shoreline Living magazine, a list of native plants broken down into moisture and sun versus shade characteristics. Eagle has best management practice fact sheets, and also information on terrestrial invasive species. And then we also send a follow-up email after the consultation with some additional online resources and a summary of what we advised on the consultation. They generally take about less than an hour, and in addition to being a great opportunity to educate our riparians on improving their shorelines, they're a really great public relations opportunity for our association. We offer them to all riparians. They don't actually have to be members of the association, and they're free. But we do make sure that we check if they're a member or not before we go on the consultation, so that if they're not a member, we can bring a membership brochure with them and encourage them to join. Especially because this is a free service that we offer, performed mostly by volunteers. We found that people really tend to appreciate our efforts and consider that in joining the association. So a bit about how we market and educate about not only the shoreline consultations, but the topics that we talk about on the consultations. Because the beginning of our marketing process is really educating our audience about the importance of the shoreline ecosystem and how to be responsible lakefront homeowners. People won't want a shoreline consultation if they don't see a benefit to improving the shoreline ecosystem. So we publish, as I said before, a monthly or bi-monthly e-bulletin that we use as our primary channel to communicate with our members. And we worked pretty hard on growing our audience, the people who receive these e-bulletins. So a couple years ago, we actually paid for some Facebook advertisements through a media services contractor so we could have people sign up and receive our e-bulletins to increase the number of people that we could reach with our email marketing. So this brought us up to around 2,600 subscribers, which is almost double the number of our riparian households and about 4 times our number of members. So we're reaching people who are interested in the environment, who maybe live on a lake themselves, even if it's not Lake Leelanau, but also people who might not yet be members, and this could encourage them to be members. So then we have also included a section in our e-bulletin that specifically promotes our shoreline consultations. It explains a bit about what they entail and encourages people to email us to sign up. It highlights that the consultations are free and for all riparians, not just members. And we have a designated email account for our group of Shoreline Ambassadors, which is provided in all of our related communications to ensure that there's always someone there to answer any questions about shorelines. And when we have blog articles in our e-bulletin that are related to shoreline living topics, we also always include a promotion to sign up for a shoreline consultation to learn more or email us with questions. And then this past spring, as our shoreline consultation season was ramping up, we decided to offer an incentive to people to sign up for our consultations. So we offered some flats of shoreline plants from our local conservation district and offered a free native plant giveaway for those who scheduled a consultation before a certain date. This proved to be highly successful, resulting in more people signing up in that short period of time than we had in either of the 2 full years prior of offering shoreline consultations. You know, people love free things. And so bouncing off that idea, Nancy has collected seeds from her own shoreline plants this fall so that we can offer a no-mow zone seed giveaway. And we've already offered this up in the fall, but we've seen a bit less success, I think probably because people just aren't thinking of gardening as much in the fall as they are in the spring. But we will continue to offer promotions so that we can continue to get out there and educate our riparians. And then we also market these consultations through direct communication with our members. We highlight this program at our annual members meeting in the summer, where we usually reach about 200 people. And this helps a lot with word of mouth, which is another method that we rely on heavily for marketing as well. We often get neighbors of people who have received shoreline consultations who want to do it for their own property. And then one other related program that I also wanted to highlight is that we have a group of our volunteers of the Lake Association who monitor any eagle permits for any shoreline work on Lake Leelanau or its inlets. So we've put together a workflow based on the severity of the project and a decision tree for how to intervene if necessary, if someone is projecting to do a project that might not be to the benefit of Lake Leelanau. So in the best case scenario, we can intercept the riparian before they submit a permit and then offer our recommendations to make their work as environmentally friendly as possible. And we offer a shoreline consultation to these applicants as well, so we can educate them firsthand on best management practices and improving their site design. So that's the best case scenario. We can get in, intervene, perform a shoreline consultation, and make their project as beneficial as possible. But if we're unable to connect with them and they don't take us up on any of our offers to assist, then we provide a public comment during the open public comment period for their application and recommend our suggestions for improving it or why we think the project really could be detrimental to the watershed. So it's kind of an indirectly related shoreline program we also have, but it feeds into the marketing of our shoreline consultations when we can intercept the project in the early phases and perform a consultation prior to their application. And then this summer, we hosted our first Shoreline Stewards event, a shoreline restoration field day. So kind of similar to a garden tour, we featured 3 properties on Lake Leelanau that had natural shoreline restoration projects in different phases of development. It was structured as like a 2-hour open house where attendees could go between the 3 properties and see firsthand how beautiful natural shorelines can be and what they might look like when they're still being established, and then talk to the homeowner about the process and ask them questions. At each property, we had the homeowner and our own shoreline ambassadors present to answer questions and highlight the work done, talk about the benefits of the shoreline. And we also had a really talented volunteer design these really nice posters for each site featuring, this one shows the benefits of native plants, but on each site, I'll show you in a moment, feature before and after photos and some details on the property. So just a brief highlight of the properties we featured and the kinds of information we highlighted. So this was an ongoing project at one of actually our Shoreline Ambassadors houses, who is doing a low energy bioengineering project on his own. So featured some before and after photos, and we're able to see it as it's actually in process. Then we featured an established shoreline with a very nice vegetative buffer that also accommodates the recreational use of the shoreline. And then also a slightly more complicated shoreline with a very steep slope, which was actually a project that was just completed earlier that summer before the event and was done by a local natural shoreline contractor who is a Michigan Natural Shoreline Partnership certified natural shoreline professional. This was a really cool project to feature because of the more advanced bioengineering that went into it, and we were able to have the professionals there to explain in greater detail the work that went into it. And then very graciously, those same shoreline contractors also helped us by presenting to the attendees at a fourth location for a little wrap-up and Q&A session for the event with the whole group after they had just toured the 3 properties. So this worked out really well because we had actually worked with this same contractor the year before on a grant application to do a shoreline restoration project at that site. It was at one of our boat launches. Unfortunately, we were not awarded that grant and still haven't been able to complete the project, but we were able to utilize the site plans that had been prepared to feature during this presentation. So it was kind of a cool opportunity to look at the site there as a blank slate and then look at the site drawings and envision what it could look like, which I think was especially impactful after folks had just toured the other 3 properties before coming there. So this was a really well-received event. We sent out a survey to attendees afterwards and had really positive feedback, and have even had some of the attendees now sign up for their own shoreline consultations. And so now that I've told you a bit about our program, the Shoreline Stewards one specifically, how we developed and marketed it, I'd like to share some of our metrics that we use to show our success. So we've had a growing number of consultations from 19 in 2022, up a bit in 2023 to now 36 consultations in 2024. We have been increasing our number of contacts. We've been in touch with at least 88 people, which is about 16% of our membership, and certainly more in those we have contacted through our email campaigns. And then we have gone from just 1 shoreline ambassador to now 4 certified shoreline ambassadors, and we have 5 in training and counting. And then at each consultation, we ask the riparian how much shoreline property they own. And based on our conversations during the consultation, we estimate the feet of shoreline that we think they'll actually work on to improve. And based on that estimate, we anticipate that over time, about 1.62 miles of Lake Leelanau's shoreline will be naturalized and improved because of just our 3 years of consultations. And then another metric that we are working on is based on a shoreline survey that was performed in 2017 using aerial drones. So this survey classified each parcel on Lake Leelanau based on the categories of the slide. Sorry, I'll go back real quick so you can see that. So it's basically their scale of environmental friendliness. So are they using lake water irrigation? Do they have natural shorelines or green belts, or do they have seawalls that are not so good for the lake? No green belts. And then also goes into, were terrestrial invasive species identified during the survey? Is there evidence of erosion? Things like that. So then this has given us a baseline for the Lake Leelanau shoreline properties from years before we even had our Shoreline Stewards program, and where we put such concentrated efforts on improving our lake shoreline. So we plan to repeat this survey in the future after several years of our programming to allow for the message to reach people and the time it takes to actually do this work. And so if the metrics that I just shared are any indicator, I'm cautiously optimistic that we will see a change for the better in these numbers for our next shoreline survey. And then for the terrestrial invasive species metrics so far, like I said, we are just beginning this program. And we won't repeat those surveys for another couple of years when we'll really get the full metrics on what has been improved. But we have been tracking those who have been in contact with us about control. So for those who have completed our request in contacting us about purple loosestrife control using Galarusella beetles, we've had about a 10% contact rate. And then cumulatively for all of the methods, we had an 11% contact rate from what we recorded. And hopefully there are more than that, because I hope that some riparians have used what we've given them and done some control on their own, but just didn't manage to contact us and tell us about it. So we are definitely learning from these metrics, and we'll continue with both our broad and direct communication to try to get more and more people to control these terrestrial invasive species on their properties, with subsequent follow-up communications to those we've already contacted to try to get those numbers higher so that we can reach our reduction goals in the next couple of years. So I hope that this has given you a look at what can be done to protect a lake's shoreline from really a mostly volunteer-driven lake association. I am a full-time employee, but most of this work is done with assistance from volunteers. And also taking the wealth of materials and information available from the state of Michigan and other organizations and applying all that information for the benefit of our riparians and our lake in general. Protecting the shoreline from terrestrial invasive species and overdevelopment are incredibly important factors to lake health, and every little bit counts. So I thank you now for your time, and I open it up for questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Annalise. We have a lot of questions already in the chat, but I'm going to open it up to anybody who's still online. If you'd like to unmute, please feel free to ask your question aloud, or otherwise Jessica and I will jump into the reading the chat questions.
Don't be shy.
Okay, I'll start with some of the chat questions. You were asked, which contractor did you use for detections for the terrestrial invasive species, and how long did the surveys take?
We contracted with One Less Consulting, a contractor based out of Williamsburg. I know that they have limited time to do these kinds of things, but they were able to help us out. It's pretty much a one-woman operation. And it took we did, I think, a day each on North Lake Leelanau and South Lake Leelanau. Lake Leelanau is a fairly big lake, about 9,000 acres. So yeah, I think they took one day for North Lake and one day for South Lake. And then also additional time with compiling all of the information, getting it into the database, and then getting all of the address, contact information from the county parcel database.
There's a question about the terrestrial invasive species effectiveness with the beetles. You did share some numbers about like metrics with percent contacts, and it's still early days, but have you found the beetles to be reasonably effective at actually eating the plants in purple loosestrife along Lake Leelanau?
Yeah, good question. And again, we have just released them for the first year as a lake association, although the Leelanau Conservancy has been releasing them on one of their properties, which is in the Narrows, in that really heavily infested area that I showed on the map. They've been releasing a few pots on their properties for the past several years and really have reduced their populations in that area. So the photos that I showed were from one of our board members who had the beetles released on his property. And even though we haven't repeated the survey yet and won't plan to do so for another couple of years, anecdotally, we have heard from him that he has seen bite marks, chew marks spread from where we place the plant beyond into the greater infestation. And this spring will really be how we'll see how they've overwintered and if they continue to do so. But we do plan to plant more beetles there this coming year as well.
Thank you. Like I said, there's a lot of questions in the chat. So the next one is, did you identify the properties for your shoreline consultations, or did you wait for them to approach you? Like what was the order of operations there in terms of like contact with getting involved with the Shoreline Ambassador program?
Yeah, that's a good question. We have waited for them to contact us. Um, uh, Other than in the case of when someone applies for a permit to do any shoreline work, then we, like I said in our Eagle public comment subcommittee, we actually do contact them if we see that their project could be of detriment to Lake Leelanau. But our general approach is to have people contact us. But that is something that could be done with the shoreline survey that I just touched on that we did in 2017. Um, if you identified a property that you saw was that could be really detrimental, then one could reach out. But we've kind of seen it more as our role of a lake association to educate and allow people to contact us if they want to do any work.
You were asked, do the shoreline consultations and the resources that are available, do you find them equally applicable to riparians on streams and rivers as well as lakes?
That's a good question, and one that I haven't had a huge amount of experience with because we haven't had many of those instances. Um, but in general, I would say a lot of the things are applicable, but there are just some different considerations in rivers and streams than in lakes because of the differences in the water movement. But in general, the practices used on lake environments and river environments are somewhat similar in terms of how you treat your property to prevent from erosion and to prevent from pollutants entering the lake from your land.
Does bioengineering work on all types of shorelines? Examples, a shoreline with trees you are not removing.
Shoreline trees are not removing. There are different strategies for doing bioengineering projects. So no one project is going to be the same as other projects unless you have an exactly similar parcel. Um, so they are effective, but there are also different levels of bioengineering from lower energy, which would be more applicable to an inland lake, to higher energy projects that might be done on the Great Lakes or areas of a lake that really get impacted by high wave energy. I absolutely would say that they are effective, but it depends on how they are designed and engineered specific to the property.
And the last question I see in the chat is, those are great handouts your association made with regarding like shorelines and fertilizing. Do you ever share those with other lake associations in the area?
Yes, absolutely. Something I did mean to mention is that we have a wealth of information on our website and that we send out with our e-bulletin. So if you go to lakeleelanau.org, I think it's labeled as a posts heading on our main page of our website, and that, or maybe it's publications, and that shows you all of the blog articles that we feature in our e-bulletin, which usually include additional resources to click on. Most of the resources that I've mentioned here, and you can absolutely take that information. This is all to the benefit of everybody else. We have, we didn't invent these methods. We've used resources from others and we cite them on those publications as well. So absolutely feel free to take that information from us. You can sign up for our e-bulletin on our website as well so that you can get the reminder and not have to constantly be checking it yourselves. There's a link to sign up on our Get Involved tab, I believe. So yes, absolutely take our information. It's for the good of all.
Well, thank you so much, Annalise. If there are any other questions, again, please feel free to unmute yourselves to ask them or put them in the chat, and Jessica and I will take a look at those.
Hello, I have a question.
Hi, John.
Hi. I had a question about the garden tour day. A few questions really. Like, what kind of participation did you guys have as far as numbers? And then how did that run? Did folks, was it kind of you just stopped by between a time at any of the three sites, or did people move from site to site to site? I'm just kind of curious how that whole program went.
Yeah. So in terms of numbers, we limited the number of signups based mostly because of parking limitations at each site. We had it as an open house 2 hour window where people could go between the sites. So I guess if you structured it differently where you had a set time for one site and a set time for another site, you could vary the number of participants because of that. But because we had it scheduled as an open house, we weren't exactly sure how many people would show up and when. So we had to limit the number of participants because of parking limitations at the sites. But we had about 20 participants, and that's about what we planned for. And yeah, like I said, we had a 2 hour window when people could go between the three sites. And then after that 2 hours, which was accounting for some travel time, it worked out really well for us, just coincidentally, that the three sites that we had available to us were all on the same side of the lake. As you could see, Lake Leelanau is a long, skinny lake. So going from like the northeast side to the southwest side takes a good amount of travel time. So it worked out well that they were all pretty close to each other. And so after that 2 hour period, they had time to go to all three sites and spend, about 20 minutes at each site, and then meet up at the Bingham boat launch at the end, where we had that Q&A session with the shoreline contractor.
Cool.
And we published that in our e-bulletin. It included the link to sign up, and then we sent out all of the details for the event once people had registered.
We had another question in the chat. Have you considered expanding your shoreline education to local schools?
That's a great question. We have been considering how to get our programming into schools, not only with our Shoreline Stewards program, but also with a lot of aquatic invasive species control and prevention programs. And it's really a question of our resources as a mostly volunteer-driven lake association. We are working on it, but again, it's a resource limitation at this point. But hopefully, as we get more and more shoreline ambassadors, as we are seeing, we will have more capacity to do more of that.
Great. Well, we are almost at time here. Annalise, do you mind switching to that next slide? I just want to invite everybody to save the date. We have 2 more webinars in January, how to build a boat wash station. And this is again featuring some success stories from the Lake Leelanau Lake Association. And then we have a webinar about using art to talk about aquatic invasive species with the artist Linda Hamilton, who made some paper sculptures for the Benzie Conservation District last year. So please save the date for those, and the information is on our website. But thank you all so much for joining us with your lunchtime hour. And thank you, Annalise, for giving this amazing talk. I know that there's probably going to be way more questions that come in through email over the coming days. So thank you for sharing your expertise. I'll send up a follow-up email to everybody who registered. There'll be a link to the recording. It'll be on our YouTube page. So please spread the word. We need more Shoreline Stewards.